Hey everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my top 10 masking fluid tips. These are the main things that I wish I had known as a beginner getting started with watercolor and using masking fluid with watercolor that would have really helped me arrive at better results and also would have helped me avoid undesired accidents. As I move along sharing this information on this awesome tool, you're going to see me work on this watercolor mushroom piece. For this piece, I used masking fluid in a variety of different ways, which I'll be talking a little bit about later. And it played a huge role in me being able to arrive at these results. So before jumping into my 10 tips, there are a few different things that I want to talk about. Masking fluid, otherwise known as liquid Frisket, is essentially liquid latex. When we place it on paper and allow it to dry and later paint on those areas, that little layer of masking fluid blocks that paint from reaching the paper and getting absorbed into it. It protects those sections of our paper that are very light in value or that we want to keep as highlights, and this is incredibly important when we're painting with watercolor because the white paper stands in place for our highlights. White paint is not necessary when we're working with watercolor. I never bring white paint in because I am using the white paper as my highlights and I'm using the brightness under the paint and the medium's translucency to help me create lighter value areas. Of course, for this, you need to plan those lighter value areas that you're going to be developing so that you can block them out before starting with the painting process. But this is something that I do anyway, even when I'm not using masking fluid. When the painting process is finished or the artist has arrived at a certain point in the painting process when she or he is ready to remove that masking fluid is removed or peeled off and those sections of pristine, clean white paper are revealed. The next thing that I want to talk about is whether I think masking fluid is necessary in order to create great watercolor paintings. And the answer to this is no, definitely not. However, it can really make the painting process much easier when painting certain types of subjects, such as objects that are made up of shiny, reflective materials, such as metal or glass, which require lots of complex little hard highlights. It can also really help facilitate the process of painting white objects, such as white flowers, even white buildings. And it can help us very easily create very interesting looking textures such as wood, hair, grass, whiskers in animals, etc. And there is one last thing that I wanted to briefly talk about before getting into today's tips. And this is the reasons why lots of beginners getting started with watercolor don't like using masking fluid. Most of the time, when beginners come to this conclusion that they don't like to use masking fluid, it is due to the fact that they had some sort of unpleasant experience with this tool. And this is usually due to a lack of knowledge, practice, or simply patience. And most of these things can be fixed with the tips that I'm going to be sharing later. One of these reasons that I've heard on why people don't like using masking fluid is that it is smelly. Some masking fluids are so smelly that they can even make your head hurt. And this is due to the fact that masking fluid has ammonia in it. And it is very important that we work in an open space that is well ventilated. Another reason why I've heard that people don't like using masking fluid is because they've had past experiences where they have ripped or damaged their paper when it came time to remove that masking fluid. I'll talk more about this later when I get into the tips, but it's very important that you know that when you're going to be bringing in masking fluid, you have to use higher quality paper that is at least 140 pounds in thickness or in weight. Oftentimes, cheaper or thinner paper is not going to be helpful at all and is going to get easily damaged. And it's also important that you know that some specific masking fluids out there adhere more to the paper than others and are more difficult to remove. I personally enjoy using this masking fluid from Winsor & Newton that you're seeing on screen right now. I've never had any issues with it. There are definitely other reasons that could lead to you damaging your paper when using masking fluid, even when working on thicker or higher quality paper, such as rushing the process, bringing in heat tool, and other things that I'm going to be talking about next. And finally, one of the other reasons that I've heard that people don't like using masking fluid is because it adds steps to the process. And this is true. You definitely have to add a couple of extra steps to the process, and you need to allow that masking fluid to dry completely before starting with the painting process. However, once that masking fluid is dry and it's keeping those light areas or highlight sections protected for you, you can work a lot faster during the actual painting process because you don't have to feel like you're walking on eggshells having to make your way around highlights. So even though it does involve a couple of extra steps and waiting for it to dry a few minutes, it certainly helps you speed up the painting process later on. Honestly, I think that once you have enough practice working with masking fluid, the total time it takes you to complete a piece with or without it is more or less the same. Of course, the level of complexity and detail involved in a piece is also going to have a great impact on how long it takes. But this is more so comparing two pieces of the same level of complexity and the style and detail, one in which you did use masking fluid and one in which you didn't. All right, so having said all this, I am now moving on to sharing my top 10 tips or things that I wish I had known as a beginner getting started with watercolor and using masking fluid with watercolor that would have helped me really speed up my learning process and arrive at better results, as well as avoid undesired accidents. Tip number 1 is make sure that you're doing some planning and prep work before jumping in. And with this, I mean, ask yourself some questions and maybe even jot down the steps that you're going to be working through, because this is going to help the process go a lot more smoothly, and it'll make it a lot more likely that you're going to arrive at results that you'll love. So a few questions that I personally like asking myself before jumping in include, what am I going to be masking out? Is it just highlight areas and lightest value shapes? Is it highlight shapes plus other lines and marks and shapes that are going to help me create visual textures? Am I going to be masking out the entire subject? Let's just say I am painting a landscape with a white lighthouse. Am I going to be masking out the entire lighthouse so that I can freely work on the sky, the ocean, and the ground area beneath it without having to worry about getting paint in that white lighthouse? Or maybe I'm painting a white flower and I want to mask out the entirety of the petal area so that I can freely paint the background and then tackle the petals. And aside from this, I ask myself, at what point in the process am I going to be removing the masking fluid? Because you don't have to wait until the painting process is completely finished before removing your masking fluid. Yes, you have to make sure that the paint is completely dry before you remove your masking fluid, but most of the time I remove it when I'm around 80% done with the piece, and then I finish the last 20 or 30% after the masking fluid has been removed. So it all depends on what you're masking out and the effects that you're personally going for. And finally, in this prep stage, before jumping into the actual creation of the final piece, something that I always do is, if I am going to be bringing in supplies, maybe alternative tools to place my masking fluid, or I'm going to be using different techniques, or I need to lay down the masking fluid in a specific type of shape or stroke, I make sure to practice these things on a scrap piece of paper before actually doing it in my final piece. Especially when you're just getting started with this tool, it can be kind of frustrating because you're still lacking that control. And even to me, it happens at this point after having practiced a ton, where you have too much of that masking fluid drip down or flow down whatever tool it is that you're using. And then all of a sudden you have a big blob of masking fluid, a larger shape of masking fluid, if you will, than what you actually wanted. The more you practice, the less this happens, the easier it becomes to control. And if this ever does happen, don't freak out. I would recommend just allowing it to dry completely. You can then remove it and correct that shape. All right, jumping into tip number 2. And this one is explore different tools for placing your masking fluid. So for this piece that you're seeing me working on, I used 3 different tools to place my masking fluid. I used toothpicks to mask out those little white shapes in the mushroom top. I also used that toothpick to create those tapered strokes for the blades of grass. I used a cheap multimedia brush to mask out the stem And I used an old toothbrush to do splattering to create visual texture all throughout the piece. All of these tools allow me to mask out different kinds of shapes and lines and create different types of effects and textures. And I want to encourage you to explore different tools because this can really help you open up your horizons and help you discover new techniques that will help you arrive at amazing visual results. Piggybacking off that last tip, tip number 3 is consider not placing your masking fluid with a paintbrush, and if you are using a paintbrush, make sure that you're protecting those bristles before using it to place your masking fluid. I would never ever recommend that you use more expensive brushes or whatever brushes are your favorite ones for masking fluid placement. And this is because even though there are certain methods that you can use in order to protect those bristles to a certain extent, even when you protect those bristles, over time that masking fluid is going to continue deteriorating that brush. So because masking fluid is liquid latex, it dries fast and it dries hard. And if you don't protect the bristles of your paintbrush, you can expect that masking fluid to completely ruin your paintbrush pretty quickly. That masking fluid is impossible to remove from those paintbrush bristles after it's dried, leaving it completely unusable. And so every time I'm going to be using a paintbrush to place my masking fluid, I make sure that the paintbrush that I am using is cheap, that it is old, used up. Maybe I was even getting to a point of throwing it out. And I also make sure to completely coat those paintbrush bristles with dishwashing soap before dipping my paintbrush in that masking fluid. You can use something like dishwashing soap or regular bar soap to prep your paintbrush. All you have to do is dampen your paintbrush bristles with water, add a little bit of dishwashing soap in the palm of your hand, and then run your paintbrush bristles gently over that dishwashing soap until they are completely covered. Another thing that you can do, pre-moisten those paintbrush bristles and run the bristles of your paintbrush over a bar of soap. That is going to help keep them protected. You can then go ahead and, as I said, dip it in your masking fluid and use it as you wish. And then after you are done, you want to make sure that you're rinsing out and washing out your paintbrush bristles immediately and not set it off to the side and allow that to dry. Tip number 4 is mind your paper. So as I was mentioning in the beginning of this video, you want to make sure that you're using the appropriate tools for the process or techniques on hand. I always make sure that I am using quality paper that is at least mid-weight. So 140 pounds in thickness or in weight is what I usually go for. I like making sure that my paper is 100% cotton if possible. And this is because I know that lower quality paper or even thinner paper can easily rip or get damaged. If you have any doubts that the paper that you are thinking of using might not be appropriate for bringing in masking fluid, I would definitely recommend doing a few tests before actually working on your final piece that you're going to be spending more time on. Take a small piece of that paper that you're thinking of using, place a few lines or shapes using your masking fluid that you're planning on using, wait around 15 minutes and gently try to remove it. If all is well and you don't damage your paper, then you're good to go. I would also recommend whenever you're thinking of investing in a new masking fluid, read reviews before you buy. If there are a lot of reviews from people saying that the masking fluid attached to the paper way too strongly and they had issues with removing it, consider looking for a different brand. Moving on to tip number 5, and this is work patiently and allow things to dry whenever you need to. Make sure that A, you're placing your masking fluid on paper that is completely dry. Make sure that your masking fluid is completely dry before you start to paint over it. And C, make sure that your painting is completely dry before you remove your masking fluid. If you rush the process and don't do these things, this can also lead to you tearing your paper when you're trying to remove your masking fluid. In the same vein, you don't want to use heat tools to speed up the drying process when you have masking fluid on your watercolor paper. And this is because that heat can make that masking fluid adhere to the paper much more strongly. It attaches to that paper and then you have trouble removing it and can rip that paper. I always make sure to allow my painting and my paper, anything that I am doing, to dry naturally when I am using masking fluid. If you make sure that you're only placing a small amount of masking fluid or a thin layer of masking fluid in those areas or shapes that you're looking to mask out, it should dry relatively quickly, max 10-15 minutes. The greater the amount of masking fluid you place on paper, the longer it's going to take to dry. And of course, the environment that you're working in, whether you're working in a warm environment, a cold environment, a dry environment, or a humid environment, or you have a fan on or heating system on or air conditioning unit on, all of these things are going to have an impact on how slowly or how quickly your masking fluid and your paint dries throughout this process. You'll know that your masking fluid is completely dry when it has more of a transparent yellowish look on that surface that it's been placed on. When you use masking fluid that is uncolored, because there are certain masking fluids that have color in them, it looks milky, like an opaque white in the bottle or when it's just been placed on paper. And as it dries, it becomes more and more transparent and more yellowish. Another thing that you can do to check that it's completely dry is you can run your fingers over it or touch it, and it should feel somewhat tacky but no longer sticky to the touch. Moving on to tip number 6, and this one is explore softening edges and making shapes smaller after you've removed your masking fluid. So if you remove your masking fluid and you find that those white shapes that you've created are way too stark looking or way too big, you can soften those edges by going over them and doing gentle scrubbing with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, and then dab that area that you have done your scrubbing on with your absorbent towel to remove some of that pigment off your page. You can also make those white shapes smaller if you want to by painting inside of them. If you are going to be doing some scrubbing, just make sure that you're doing it gently and that you don't go overboard, because it can be very easy to start overworking our paper and start damaging it. This said, softening those edges of the white shapes that you create with masking fluid is relatively easy. Moving into tip number 7, and this one is make sure that you're not shaking your bottle of masking fluid before you use it. And this is because when you shake that bottle, you create air bubbles in that liquid. And when you try to place it on paper, those air bubbles have an impact on those shapes that you're creating with your masking fluid, and you can arrive at undesired effects. Moving into tip number 8, and this one is you can add a little bit of water into your masking fluid if you want to make the consistency less thick. If you are going to be adding water into your masking fluid, just make sure that you add in a tiny bit at a time. It can be easy to add in way too much, and this can negatively impact the masking that you try to do. It's also good to know that masking fluid tends to thicken in the bottle over time. This doesn't mean that it becomes unusable, but you may have to add in a little bit more water if you notice that it is becoming thicker. Moving on to tip number 9, and this one has to do with the last one. Make sure that you're closing your masking fluid bottle tight so that no air is able to get into the bottle, because if this happens, your masking fluid is going to start drying out. Masking fluid can last a very long time in the bottle in a usable state if it is closed tightly. But if air starts getting in there, it's going to become thicker and thicker to the point that it's going to harden and become completely unusable. And finally, getting into tip number 10, this one is make sure that you're not leaving your masking fluid on your watercolor sheet for way too long, because over time it can adhere more to that sheet. Some people say that you shouldn't leave masking fluid on your watercolor paper for longer than 48 hours. Other people say it can be up to a week. I know that I have left masking fluid on watercolor paper for up to 2 weeks, but it was 100% cotton, high quality paper, and it was this masking fluid from Winsor & Newton, and it was perfectly fine. Nothing got damaged when I removed it. I tried to avoid this kind of situation though as much as possible. I was a little bit nervous that I would be damaging the paper, so just stay mindful of this and try not to keep it on there for too long. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited. They are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.